Welcome back, everyone. As an institute firmly rooted in the humanities, I'm sure you'll agree it's very fitting that we have a session on music included in today's program. And perhaps out of all the vital topics we've already discussed and will discuss, music is perhaps the most central to human experience, perhaps second only to wine. But you'll surely agree it's got a very special role to play in how we make sense of how we experience the world and what it means to be human. As Margaret Fuller said 2 centuries ago, all truth is comprised in music and mathematics. And as more recently, in our own century, the cosmologist and jazz saxophonist Stephen Alexander observed, it's less about music being scientific and more about the universe being musical. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful panel. The main speaker is Professor Georgina Born, who teaches anthropology at the Institute of Advanced Studies at UCL and teaches also music at King's College London. She's also Professor of Music and Anthropology at Oxford and Professorial Fellow of Mansfield College. She's taught sociology, anthropology and music for many, many years at Cambridge, besides appointments at UCL and King's. She's also had appointments at Aarhus in Denmark and at Yale. We're very lucky that she's been at Oxford, where she's had a major ERC grant project on how digital media transforms music. She's performed both classical and modern music, and recorded and performed with great many groups, and has also got a fascinatingly illustrious family, which I won't go into now, but you should definitely ask her about or look up. Second, we have Dr. Jenny Judge, who is currently a philosopher at the Centre for Bioethics at NYU and an incoming assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Melbourne. Jenny has 2 PhDs and degrees in maths, philosophy and music. Her first PhD from the University of Cambridge is in music, and her thesis argued that philosophers of mind and perception should pay much more attention to music psychology and people's musical experience. Her second PhD, as you might expect, from NYU was in philosophy and brought together her interest in aesthetics, the philosophy of mind, and perception. Finally, we've got Professor David Roure, who's Professor of E-Research and in the Engineering Science Department here at Oxford, and a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. His research is as interdisciplinary as it gets, connecting music, maths, AI, creativity, and music composition performance, and brings together the humanities, social sciences, computer science, engineering, information science, and I gave you the short version. You won't be surprised to hear that he's been involved in everything to do with digital humanities at Oxford, as well as a great many interdisciplinary research initiatives. He's also co-founded 3 huge interdisciplinary research centres. The world's largest socio-technical research centre on the Internet of Things and cybersecurity, the Software Sustainability Institute, and the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music at the Royal Northern College of Music. We couldn't be more excited that you've decided to join us today. And with that, the floor's yours.
So our theme today is AI and judgment, to consider to what extent human judgment might be enhanced, replaced or undermined by AI tools, and how judgment has varying significance in different areas of activity. So my focus is on machine learning-based recommender systems applied to music, which means we're broadly in the vicinity of aesthetic judgment. I learned in earlier conversations with Jenny Judge that for Kant, the distinctiveness of aesthetic judgments is that they are normative, but don't consist in the application of rules. In this respect, then, our problematic departs from that of the previous sessions, and I'm sure Jenny will say more about this later. Online platforms that host cultural content such as music, film, television, use recommender systems to curate and distribute items from their catalogues. Indeed, recommender systems have become the dominant means today of curating cultural content, significantly influencing the nature of both individual and, when multiplied by billions of uses, collective cultural experience. Academic and industrial research on recommender systems optimizes for so-called personalized user experience. As a result, I think, these fields don't generally acknowledge the ways in which recommender systems influence cultural experience cumulatively over time and in the aggregate across populations. What's going to move this? Okay. So I confess that I'm not a philosopher, and I come at this topic from anthropological and sociological perspectives. Currently, I direct this 5-year ERC-funded research program on music and AI. It's called MuzAI, and it's critically examining the cultural implications of AI through 10 projects addressing its relationship with music. Recommender systems are one focus of our work, which is at an early stage. Happily, 2 recent studies have come out that I'm going to use as I talk about this today, and they provide rich accounts of the development of recommender systems. First is Nick Seaver's book, Computing Taste, which is an ethnography of the industry making recommendation systems for music streaming services and the science of music information retrieval, or MIR, and I'll talk quite a lot about MIR today. It's kind of data science for music that lies behind it. And secondly, the Ada Lovelace Institute has just published an interview-based report on the BBC's efforts to develop recommenders for news and audiovisual content, including music, that embody public service values. I'll draw on these and other studies as I go. So what I want to pull out, those are the studies I just mentioned, what I want to pull out is how recommender systems for music largely, although not entirely, bracket aesthetic judgment as a component of the development of musical taste by relying on alternative ways of conceptualizing and framing what listeners want to hear. Now, in doing so, I'll argue, recommender systems are built on an impoverished understanding of the nature and the development of taste and judgment, impoverished in terms of both musical and social dimensions of music. And this impoverished understanding is used to fuel powerful technologies that condition not only what listeners encounter when consuming recorded music, but their very expectations about the nature of musical experience. A key observation will be the gulf that has tended to exist between MIR and recommender systems as scientific fields and those existing disciplines that might, through sustained collaboration, help to inform better models and better systems. The music disciplines, the anthropology and sociology of music, media studies, and science and technology studies, or STS. Now, staging these collaborations is one core aim of my research program, and we've already made some interesting progress. To fill this out, 2 central contentions are, first, that we should not conceive of taste, aesthetic experience, or judgment as fully formed on the part of either individuals or collectives, but as developing and evolving, even progressing. It follows that the curation of what might be encountered by individuals and groups to further the development of their aesthetic experience carries serious responsibilities, responsibilities that can't evade the need for judgment. Judgment relative to particular pieces, tracks, or genres of music, but relative also to the kinds of developmental pathways likely to foster growth and flourishing in musical experience. And this is the idea I want mainly to pursue today. And by the way, I take these points to hold for appreciation of popular music and culture, as well as high music and art. And in this way, I join all those who consider that the progressive development of taste and aesthetic experience both matters and occurs in relation to popular music and culture as much as the high arts. Yet, the prevailing mindset of the designers of recommendation systems is that individual consumers do come with fully formed tastes, and that they merely seek something similar in the next track they listen to. An interesting exception is when recommended designers attend to the need for what's called diversity, as they have in recent years under the pressure of Black Lives Matter and other identity political movements, which, if I had time, I'd speak about more. Now, this belief in culturally self-sufficient individuals whose autonomous consumer choices need nudging can be linked, I think, to the tenets of American liberalism, but also to the long-standing links between computer science and behaviorist psychology. The result is that the design culture of recommender systems evacuates any awareness of the responsibilities of assisting in the progressive development of aesthetic experience. Now, my second contention is that the nature of aesthetic experience in music may center on, but is far from confined to digitized recorded sound, for this brackets other social, embodied, and sensory dimensions of music that contribute to aesthetic experience. Now, this is an established idea in ethnomusicology, popular music studies, and increasingly in the philosophy of music, but I'm not going to pursue it here. I'll argue then that we need a new generation of critical commentary on recommender systems and a new generation of recommended technologies. And today I'm going to sketch some of this territory. My argument turns in part on the need for a different account to those prevalent in recommended design of the dynamic and social nature of the development of taste, of how cultural experiences and the aesthetic sensibilities they subtend evolve, as well as how music and the arts contribute to individual and collective cultural awareness in the sense captured by theorists of cultural citizenship. Now, such an alternative account has to be both empirically informed and normative, and later I hope to say more about cultural citizenship. So what are recommender systems? To cite that great fount of wisdom, Wikipedia, quote, "A recommender system is a subclass of information filtering system that provides suggestions for items that are most pertinent to a particular user. Typically, the suggestions refer to various decision-making processes, such as what product to purchase, what music to listen to, or what online news to read. Recommender systems are particularly useful when an individual needs to choose an item from a potentially overwhelming number of items that a service may offer. They're used in a variety of ways, with commonly recognized examples taking the form of playlist generators for video and music services. Now, already we can discern two pervasive assumptions characterizing the recommender field. First, this foundational stress on users facing an overwhelming archive of materials, news, music, shopping choices, that renders them in need of automated filtering devices, a discourse that Siever contextualizes with reference to the long history of the idea of information overload, often credited to Alvin Toffler's 1970 best-selling book, Future Shock. And second, we can notice the individuation and consumer orientation whereby the problem of information overload is linked naturally to a sovereign individual's need to choose among a given range of items or services. Now, reinstalling claims of information overload in history, Siever shows how they're always deployed to summon up techniques to mitigate it, most recently filtering algorithms. I'd add that conceiving of recommenders as what STS calls socio-technical systems, we should also recognize their formative power, how they don't so much reflect the nature of taste formation, which is how they're often represented by the sciences behind their design, but are powerful machines for producing a particular process of taste formation, that is, how they are performative. Now, Siva pursues the discourse of information overload through its take-up in cybernetics, in the period of escalating analogies between human brains and telephone and computing systems. As he puts it, quote, information overload rendered the familiar feeling of being overwhelmed as a technical problem. By 1960, the psychologist James Grier Miller reported on 5 studies of overload manifest in neurons, brains, individuals, small groups, and institutions, measuring their information processing capacity and cataloguing the adjustment mechanisms they used when overloaded, such as making errors or skipping some inputs. As the historian Nick Levine argues, Miller's work, part of a nascent cognitive science, quote, represented a reconceptualization of human beings as communication channels whose capacity could be overwhelmed. So information overload as a long-standing key discursive brick in the pillar that has become music recommendation, and one that summons up technical solutions and that's part of a discourse with much wider purchase in computer science. Siva also pursues personalization as another key brick in this pillar, and how it's been justified by recourse to the idea of the central importance of individual human variation through a kind of folk social theory of individuated differentiation. Let's notice that the sort of standard schema of demographic sociological analysis is somehow evacuated in this way. And he sums up this core tenet of music recommendation design culture as people like different things, and they like things in different ways. Now, a third brick in the pillar, and one that Siva doesn't quite get to, are the ahistorical and atemporal assumptions in the design culture of music recommendation as a scientific field. So the process of recommendation is conceived and modeled in the terms of serial, individual, one-off choices, guided broadly by this idea of similarity. In MIR's preoccupation with the meandering pathways of sovereign, individuated choice via the attractions of similarity, any more temporally extended concern with the development of taste or with how taste should evolve over time, either across the individual life course or collectively in the sense of progressive cultural change, are evacuated in favor of inductive, consumption-oriented behaviorist functionalism. In this way, as I mentioned before, there's an ideological dimension to this evacuation in that the music recommender field and MIR fail to acknowledge the wider aggregate effects of recommender systems over time and across populations. For let's be in no doubt, despite their personalized address, recommender systems are having cumulative effects, shaping the wider cultures and societies within which they're being employed. Now, let's look more closely at the ideas of similarity that prevail in music recommender design, where similarity appears as a kind of empirical and inductive proxy for judgment in curation. They take 2 forms, manifest in the 2 main techniques of machine learning-based filtering. So the first model of similarity assumes that if you like that track, you'll also like this similar music track, an approach based on shared musical features manifest in what's called content-based filtering. The second model of similarity presents itself as a kind of quasi-social one. It assumes that if you like that track and other people who like that track also liked these other tracks, then because of what you share with these people, you're likely also to like the additional tracks that they like, a technique called collaborative filtering that captures a kind of contagion effect. And for those of you who know about social theory, This is very similar to Gabrielle Tard's sociology from the beginning of the 20th century. So there's a little bit more similarity there in a kind of introductory overview of MIR. Now, in time, both approaches have developed further to incorporate more contextual information into the techniques by which taste and consumption choices are measured. In time, too, MIR has debated and attempted to amend the crudeness of these models by introducing, as I alluded to earlier, concepts and normative goals of increased diversity, fairness, transparency, and so on and on. But these concerns have been kind of accretions, add-ons to the still intact model of individual human subjectivity, replete with fully formed taste, that I've sketched. Indeed, even non-commercial cultural institutions that might have been expected to be more critically conscious of the limitations of this model, such as the BBC, have not scrutinized it sufficiently, nor yet come up with alternatives, perhaps due to their dependence on a labor force trained in the wider professional cultures of data science and MIR. And I'll come back to the BBC later. I want now to explain more about the evolution of these two main recommender techniques, content-based filtering and collaborative filtering. And my aim is to characterize these research fields and to convey how internal debates and controversies have arisen that have led MIR to amend its models. And at the same time, I'm going to suggest that in each case, being more closely informed by and in dialogue with existing relevant disciplines might have mitigated their limitations. For content-based filtering, that is, the filtering and classifying of recorded music by reference to musical features, the state of the art has been the goal of automated genre recognition, a key focus of MIR research from about 2000. And in what follows, I'm going to draw heavily on the musicologist Eggert analysis of the rise and decline of this particular field. Now, automated genre recognition provided an ideal test case by which MIR, as an emergent research field, could secure both scientific and industrial legitimacy, given its immediate utility for the global music streaming platforms. But its precondition, of course, was the massive digitization of recorded music over the second half of the 1990s, which was believed to create a demand for algorithms that might search and classify the vast archives of online music, so as to allay, once again, consumers' sense of being overwhelmed. But another reason why genre recognition rose to prominence in MIR is that it seemed particularly well suited to the audio analysis and machine learning techniques in which MIR researchers are generally trained. As Drott explains, and now we get a little bit technical, once music has been rendered as data, using as a point of reference a group of songs already sorted into different categories, a machine learner can identify the sonic features that are statistically correlated among members of each category, and on this basis extrapolate to categorize as yet unlabeled audio files into genres. The main focus, Drott tells us, is on what researchers refer to as low-level features, that is, timbral and textual characteristics, and in due course these methods were supplemented by techniques representing what are called higher-level features from form, meter, rhythm, and tempo, and so on. Now, the output of these operations is a feature vector for each track. Typically, multidimensional scaling allows these vectors to be treated as if they were coordinates, and the results are plotted as a position occupied by individual genres or tracks within an n-dimensional similarity space. The fruits of this approach to musical genre have been strange but compelling maps of generic space, in which spatial closeness or proximity speaks of musical similarity and distance, lack of similarity. Now at this point I'm going to move to the net just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is a famous, the most famous output of this kind of MIR applied to musical genre. It's called a website, please look it up, it's hilarious, called Every Noise at Once. It's the brainchild of a man called Glenn MacDonald, who worked for a company called Echo Nest, which I'll talk about in a second, bought up by Spotify. So this has driven elements of Spotify's classification of music. It's a vast, extraordinary, look at this, it's huge. If you look on the left-hand side, it's metal, the zillions of subgenres of heavy metal occupy the whole of the left hand. You'll see metalcore, metal, Italian pop punk, metalcore, Ukrainian metalcore, new metalcore, and so on. And that goes on and on and on. I just want to give you the gist of this. And then somewhere, look, this is all metal here, subgenres of metal. All of this is metal still, sludge, hardcore, and so on. Then it stops, the metal stops there. And then somewhere way, way down here, I'm going to pull it up, we get to classical music. It's a tiny, tiny space here. Historically informed performance is apparently a genre. Baroque violin, Baroque cello, Taiwan classical performance, German Baroque, Baroque woodwind, American 21st century classical. This little space here in this map is the whole of classical music. And one does begin to wonder where these generic names come from. I mean, some of them are really quite bizarre. In case our music is, the sound is working, let's just have a little bit of Baroque woodwind. Here we go. We might not argue with that, but let's see what is very close to it. How about vintage chanson? Little bit of Piaf or something. So I will show you more about these kind of bizarre proximities that come out of this map in a second. So a series of criticisms of automated genre recognition have arisen over the years. I'm going to skim them very briefly. I mean, a deep problem is the very reduction of music to digitized audio signals. And certainly this reduction facilitates the kind of large-scale statistical analysis of music that MIR delivers, but it comes at significant cost. Another problem is how the genre categories employed by researchers, at least early on, tended to be very broad and static, you know, rock, classical, jazz, and so on. But you can see Glenn MacDonald's gone to the other extreme. Another is that the systems researchers developed are seldom subjected to rigorous experimental evaluation, so they often overlook the influence of confounding factors on the genre labels assigned to music files. Moreover, some genre simulation algorithms generate sounds that fail to mimic the target genre. I've realized sometimes without the researchers even apparently understanding that, noticing. And a final problem is the grouping together of tracks that sound alike according to some extracted sonic feature criterion, but inhabit entirely different historical, geographical, cultural, or social universes. And an example often made in the literature is the confusion of a piece of Renaissance lute music for acoustic folk. When content-based approaches misfire, Eric Drott comments, they often do so spectacularly. And I just want to, I'm going to pull out a small zone from that map. This is it here. And I have to tell you, when I looked at this little zone, apart from the names like New Weird Finland and classic Tunisian pop, I mean, the mind is boggled by the apparent musical similarities / proximity. So let me give you this. Electroacoustic improvisation is a very well-established art music, electronic art music genre. In Britain, it sounds like this. and it's very close to...
But I need you, darling, so come go with me.
Or... I could go on, it's such fun, but you'll have to do it yourselves. I just have to hear New Weird Finland. What is New Weird? Not so interesting. Anyway, please go on Every Noise at Once and play around. It's amazing. So what lessons can be drawn from about automated genre recognition as one foundation of music recommendation? I want to bring out how it developed, as I mentioned, at a distance from the disciplines of music analysis, musicology, ethnomusicology, music sociology, and genre theory that might productively have provided resources for thinking genre computationally in richer and more generative terms. And indeed, one of our projects in my research program pursues such interdisciplinary dialogues with internal critics from MIR to see how the computational modeling of genre might be made more compelling, and how in turn this might have implications for new relationships between quantitative and qualitative approaches in the humanities. So a few summarizing and final thoughts. The likely effects of what is a global mass experiment in altering the conditions within which billions of listeners cultivate their musical tastes and repertoires are unknown and largely unrecognized, but they will be vast and long-lasting. Cultural change at planetary scale, we might say. Unlike more instrumental applications of AI, perhaps as discussed in the panels earlier, we have no need of more efficient or economic substitutes for the everyday, socially embedded, longer-term processes enabling the development and cultivation of musical curiosity and experience. Maybe we need a more intelligent supplement, which takes me back to a question I asked of Nigel at the end of the first session, a supplement. Maybe, let's discuss that. Personalization as a paradigm in recommendation, with its untransparent data collection and analysis, its incursions into privacy and security, is generally unquestioned in this field, taken as an unmitigated good, even by the BBC. But by analogy with the negative effects on the public sphere of segmentation and fragmentation in news recommendation, surely we have to ask, does personalized recommendation in the cultural domain augur similar problems? A key question here relates to the public service principle of universality. The Ada report on the BBC's efforts in recommendation mentions universality with reference to the BBC's need to reach underserved demographics, which is fine, but it neglects the other crucial meaning of universality, that is, the importance of nurturing common forms of collective experience, not only in news, but in culture. We might say of building cultural public spheres. The recommender paradigm of similarity, I've argued, assumes a fully fleshed aesthetic subjectivity that is in no need of further cultivation. I've linked this to an ideology of the sovereign liberal subject whose taste is already adequately formed and has little need of sources of different, innovative or experimental music or culture, whether in relation to black country, trip-hop, spectralism, or mainstream pop. There's scant awareness in this ideology that aesthetic subjectivities should be conceptualized as information, as unfinished, nor of the wider changing cultural and social environments that produce those new cultural experiences that nourish aesthetic subjectivity. Let me expand that last point finally with reference to the turn in recent democratic political theory to the importance of cultural citizenship in multicultural societies, a fourth stage of citizenship that responds to the challenges posed by globalization, migration, the growing heterogeneity of the populations of nation states, and the intensification of identity politics. Cultural citizenship draws attention to a new domain of cultural rights involving the right to symbolic presence and dignifying representation, and to the ways in which cultural pluralism enriches the social fabric, in Martha Nussbaum's terms, enhancing our capacity for mutual recognition, empathy, and toleration, processes essential for the development and well-being of democratic societies. Now, if we take seriously the role of mediated cultural content, such as that curated by recommender systems, in influencing users' tastes and conditioning the wider public culture, then, by analogy with the concern in democratic theory with the formation of an educated and informed citizenry, we might add a concern with the formation of a culturally mature and aware, culturally pluralistic citizenry. In this sense, digital platforms distributing music and other cultural goods have a responsibility to provide a diversity of cultural experience and to replenish this diet, processes that must depend on complex, including aesthetic judgments in the curation. As Stuart Hall, the late leading critical race theorist, noted, quote, "The quality of life for Black or ethnic minorities depends on the whole society knowing more about the Black experience, an experience that is grasped most compellingly, as Hall himself stressed, through access to the diverse riches of Black cultural production, music, film, literature, and so on." My argument is that platforms curating cultural content have the capacity and the responsibility to play a vital role in fostering cultural citizenship, itself a precondition for the processes of ethical and social development that underlie the general condition of citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Hello, everybody. I would like to begin by thanking the organisers of this excellent workshop for putting on what has been a really stimulating day. It's really been, to me, just astonishing how to see our topic being approached from so many different angles and with so much nuance. And I think that owes to the interdisciplinary nature of the gathering. So I'm very grateful to the organisers for doing this, and more, please do more of these things. So I would like to thank Georgina for her rich and stimulating paper. There are far more ideas worth discussing in it than I have time to cover. So what I'd like to do in my commentary is to focus in on this theme of the development of taste, which was one of the central issues in Georgina's talk. And it's a theme that Abigail touched on earlier as well. What I'd like to do is to connect this notion of the development of taste to some ideas from the history of philosophy on the nature of aesthetic judgment. And I'll structure my commentary around three questions. So the first question is, how is it that one's taste can not merely change over time in the way that the weather might change, but can develop, improve in some sense? I'll focus on individual taste, regretfully setting aside the question of the development of taste at the societal level in the interest of time. The second question is, why is it important for one's taste to develop? And the third question is, what do we need to be in place if we are to develop our taste? And why exactly do music recommendation algorithms threaten to get in the way? Okay, so let's start with question one. How can taste develop or improve? I'll be taking taste to be one's capacity for making aesthetic judgments, aesthetic value evaluations for assessing the aesthetic value of something. Judgments like, this song is beautiful, this vista is sublime, something like that. So to see how taste can develop, we need to look a bit closer at what's involved in making an aesthetic judgment, or a judgment of taste, as we might say. And here in brief is what Kant says about it. Hopefully it's not in poor taste to invoke Kant at 6 p.m. after a long day of talks. Okay, so first of all, the first notable thing about judgments of taste is that they're based on feeling, specifically on pleasure. So when I judge of a piece of music that it's beautiful, I do so on the basis of a particular sort of pleasure that I feel upon hearing the music, a pleasure I take in the music. In this respect, it's a bit like saying, this tomato is delicious, or that piece of velvet feels good to the touch. But still, I don't necessarily expect others to agree with me when I say that this tomato is delicious or that the velvet feels nice to the touch, each to his own, I might think. But I do expect others to agree with me when I say that a favorite piece of music is beautiful. Like Bill Evans' Some Other Time is one of my favorites. And I really do expect people to agree with me when I say that that is beautiful. So be warned, there'll be a pop quiz later. And this, I expect people not merely just say, oh yeah, you know, it's beautiful, but actually to take pleasure in it in the way that I do. And now this expectation doesn't amount to actually predicting that everyone will in fact find the piece beautiful. I might know full well that they probably won't. This might be a source of some kind of dismay on my part. But instead, it's a matter of holding that everyone ought to find it beautiful on listening to it. So judgments of taste then have a normative dimension. There's an ought to judgments of taste. And in this respect, they're actually a bit like cognitive judgments, like that table is round. Those also make a claim on the agreement of others. If I had time, I'd say a bit about the differences between the grounds of the normativity of those claims, but I don't think I need to get into it. The point is that aesthetic judgments, for Kant, judgments of taste, in other words, occupy a really distinctive place in our epistemic architecture. So they're kind of poised between judgments of the agreeable on one hand, so judgments like this tomato is delicious, and cognitive judgments on the other hand, like that table is round. Like judgments of the agreeable, they're based in feeling, but like cognitive judgments, they have a normative dimension. They make a claim on the agreement of others. So this much already gives us an answer to our first question. Taste can develop as opposed to merely change over time as the weather might, because judgments of taste have a normative dimension. There are better and worse ways of aesthetically judging. And so there's a kind of a direction for taste to develop toward, as it were. I should say I don't have any clear idea as to what exactly the developed taste would be a taste for precisely, but like Georgina, I don't really see much reason to think that the fully developed taste would end up being a taste only for high art, as we rather archaically call it. So this leads to our second question. Why is it important that taste should develop? Well, one reason is simply that you might think, well, look, it's important to get things right generally. It's important to judge responsibly, diligently, carefully, no matter what domain one is operating in. But I think there are going to be other motivations behind the development of taste as well. To name but one, for example, there might be your desire to cultivate your musical taste, say, might be bound up with the desire to find community with other people who value as you do, who value music as you do, who value as you do generally, which is plausibly a central component of the life well lived. I think one exciting thing about Georgina's project is that it opens up the question of why exactly it's important for taste to develop. And as far as I can see, philosophers haven't paid a great deal of attention to that, though I'd be happy to be corrected. So the final question then is, so we've had, how is it that taste can develop? Why is it important for taste to develop? Finally, what needs to be in place if one is to develop one's taste, if one is to set about doing this? And why might music recommendation algorithms get in the way? So suppose I'm trying to develop my taste. The very first thing I have to do is to acknowledge that my aesthetic judgments are corrigible, as Aurora might put it. I might be falling into what we might call aesthetic error. And aesthetic errors come in at least two varieties. I might be taking pleasure in stuff that doesn't really merit it, or I might be failing to take pleasure in things that really do merit pleasure. So to get out from under either kind of error, I need to have some kind of purchase on the things that merit pleasure, independently of the pleasure or lack thereof that I happen to be taking in those things right now. As Georgina points out, curators, critics, practitioners, and other aesthetic experts, as we might term them, are in a position to help me out here. But, as Georgina also points out, today's music recommendation algorithms have no other criterion when it comes to deciding what to present you with, other than what you're likely to find pleasurable. So there's no room then for the recommendation algorithm to, for example, recommend to you something that is worth listening to, but that you're probably not going to find pleasurable, at least on first listen. So there doesn't seem to be room, in other words, for the algorithm to play the role of curator in the sense of aesthetic expert, which arguably is the that's really the core sense of that word. And one reason for this, I think, is definitely the one Georgina mentions. The designers of recommendation algorithms simply assume that our tastes are fixed and we have no desire, no need either, of course, to develop them. But I think there might be a deeper reason here. I think that the designers of music recommendation algorithms simply don't consider that not all likings are on a par, that aesthetic judgments can be arrived at in better or worse ways. And this amounts to effacing the normative dimension of aesthetic engagement entirely and actually really distorting the nature of aesthetic engagement. So it seems to me that the designers of music recommendation algorithms aren't just making it harder for each of us to develop our taste. This is what Georgina argues. I think they're effectively denying, albeit implicitly, that taste can develop in the sense of improve at all. And this is far from being the only problem with automated recommendation systems, but I think it's one of the most fundamental ones. So that's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jenny. Now we have David de Roure.
Thanks very much. And yes, thanks to the organisers and everyone for this fantastic day. It's been really stimulating. It's just me before wine, isn't it? Well, we have important Q&A with the audience. We must get to that quickly, so I won't spend too long. So the hat I'm going to wear today is as an AI practitioner. And I've been working in or alongside the community since the 80s, just for computer science and AI colleagues in the audience. If I tell you my first programming language was Lisp, then you'll instantly understand my background and everything about me. So I am part of that research community that uses computers for music analysis, known as music information retrieval, or digital musicology, or computational musicology. So you might expect me to now react to some of Georgina's comments and perhaps defend the community. I actually have to stop myself doing the opposite, which is to add my critical comments about the community. It is an extraordinary thing. Some of that feature recognition feels scientific. What frequency is middle C in this recording? But a lot of it is, like genre. That's a social construct. And there's a wonderful notion in the community of ground truth, which doesn't really exist. It's a temporary construct for the purposes of the experiments that they do in the papers they publish. It's very interesting. I won't talk too much about it now. The music theorists sometimes argue that community can only go so far because you need musicologists who really understand music to be engaged in that music information retrieval. But the thing is, there are those musicologists in the community, and you've still seen what happened. Okay, so anyway, enough about them. Maybe as a result, a few years ago I switched from analysing music to making music. So I co-founded the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music at the Royal Northern College of Music with composer Emily Howard and our Oxford colleague Marcus de Soto. That's practice-based research, and we've majored in the last 2 or 3 years on music and AI. So for example, in recent months I've been involved in the first performance by the BBC Philharmonic using live electronics with composer Rob Laidlow, who's now in Sir Nigel's College. And this week, down the road at the old fire station in Oxford, I've co-organised a public engagement with research event on music and technology through the epochs, focusing on hip-hop. And I'm responsible for curating the future of hip-hop. Imagine. No small responsibility there. Why do I think this research is important? I think we need to understand what it means to be a creative human being living in the moment in a world which is infused, pervaded by AI. So that's the world we're already entering. It's the world that our AI colleagues are all designing. But I don't think people are thinking enough about what it means to be the human living in the moment with that AI. And it'd be brilliant to put a judgment lens on that. And just to note, about that in the moment thing. We've not spoken much today about the timeliness of judgment. Or how long does it take for an AI to come to a judgment? Is there a trade-off between the speed of judgment and the quality of the judgment? That's not something that's come up, and I think it's something we have to think about as well. But the major work I've done recently is a collaboration with composer George E. Lewis, New York. George was doing music and AI back in the 80s. If you look at the program notes of his performances in the mid-80s, it looks like something that would be happening next week. It was amazing. He created a software system called Voyager on the hardware at that time. And I had the privilege before Christmas to work with him on an extension of his original Voyager software to give it what he calls a new ear. He needed a second ear for Voyager to hear some other things in the music. So Voyager performs as a member of an ensemble that, for example, is improvising. So there's no electronics, there are no loudspeakers. Voyager performs through this clavier piano. It's playing an acoustic piano, and it's just one of the band, right? But it only hears the notes people are playing using the original implementation. We were extending it to hear sonic gestures, a slide of the trombone, tongue fluttering, all sorts of other things. And he calls it an ear, and I like the metaphor, because in a way what we're talking about here is AI for machine listening. AI is an ear. It relates to what Georgina's just been talking about, and I will tie this back into that in a second. Based on today's discussions, I've been asking myself for the last few hours, is that ear emulation or imitation? But we can go back to that later. So what I want to touch on is AI as a collaborator, which is George's model, and also AI ears. And I think music might be a good exemplar of some of the things we've been talking about today. So to judgment, in many of the creative processes that I facilitate or curate, the AI has a generative and hopefully disruptive, I'll come back to that, role, and the human is making the judgment. So for example, I did a project a couple of years ago with Jennifer Walsh, who's now a professor in music faculty here, on text scores. And we trained an AI on a corpus of text scores. We generated new text scores, and we produced a book. And I recommend that you look at this online. But the method was, I was pressing a button and generating things, and two humans were looking at them and deciding what was good. And this is actually a really common and important scenario. It's what people are doing with things online for generating images from words, or generating poetry or whatever. So the human is sitting in judgment and making a selection. Sometimes we don't do that. Sometimes we let the AI do as much as it can without that intervention. But I want to focus on the human in the loop. So let me give you a scenario which sounds like a thought experiment, but it's absolutely a real experiment. And it builds on today's discussions, and it ties back into what Georgina was saying. So I can automatically generate very much more musical content than humans have time and resource to review. So what I need is an AI ear trained to do the machine listening. Like that's earlier, we wanted an eye for the medical images, although the consequences of decisions are different in music and medicine, I do accept that. But the question is, what is that ear listening for? Is it listening for music that sounds normal, or is it listening for the exception? This sounds good because it sounds like something else, or this sounds good because it doesn't sound like something else. So how do we judge novelty? And I worked last year with an artist, Memo Atkin, who asked in one of our team meetings, when were you last surprised by a piece of music? And it's a really interesting question. And people sometimes want to be surprised by music. When were you last surprised? Can an AI judge taste? So this is my version of the recommender problem. I'm focusing on production rather than consumption, but it actually relates to that Wikipedia definition we had earlier, that the recommender systems are helping an individual choose from an overwhelming number of items. And this morning, Abigail Williams talked about the relationship between rule breaking and innovation. For example, the conventions of a sonnet. And I think that's exactly what we're doing in music. If you look at contemporary classical music, for example, that's what's been happening. So how do we make judgments about rule breaking? And I love that phrase earlier. Do we have styles of departure from norms? Maybe that's what we need here. Do we have a new genre? Yes, I think we do have a new genre. And actually in music, throughout the history of music, new genres have always reflected the instruments and the technology at the time, as well as many other things. So my curated future event in the old fire station is exactly about that, the relationship between the technology and the music. Hip hop has a very close relationship with the technology. So I think an AI music genre is emerging and itself is worth looking at as a lens onto what's happening in AI. And I don't think that kind of response is confined to music. We can look at other creative activities. So to recommenders, I'm really pleased Georgina spoke about that today. Thank you. There's an excellent white paper from Georgina and colleagues, Artificial Intelligence, Music Recommendation and the Curation of Culture, which I recommend. I just want to pull out a phrase because it's exactly what I've been watching happen in the last few days. From the perspective of those making music for new platform-based distribution environments, the platforms themselves impact on how musicians craft and create their music. There are a number of emerging examples of artists adjusting their music and sounds to match the logics of the streaming platforms on which they appear. Yes, our hip-hop album, which is on Bandcamp, and I have watched the team, the collective, getting it onto Bandcamp in exactly the right way with the right bonus materials and the right metadata so it does the right things when we start promoting it at the weekend. Absolutely, the tail wags the dog. They're very happy to be engaging in that, and it feels like human versus machine in a way, but of course that machine is designed by humans. It's humans, two sets of human stakeholders mediated by an increasingly sophisticated and automated AI tools. So on that point of can we spot new music? Well, so in this ecosystem, there are companies who will claim to do that now. So there's a new company, Snafu Records, which describes itself as the first full-service record label built on AI music discovery of new artists. So they think they can do this. How do they do that? They say two things. Our proprietary algorithms analyze millions of data points from over 150,000 songs per week. So that's kind of the big data approach. And they also say our Grammy-nominated songwriting team have penned dozens of Billboard-topping songs and collaborate with our roster to make many more. That's the human piece. So I won't talk about it so much now, but we've spoken today about humans and AI, but I'm not sure the AIs we're talking about today exist independent of humans. Can an AI even exist in isolation? I think we could always think in terms of human AI collectives. And actually, we spent some years studying this. Nigel led a project called Social Machines, Theory and Practice of Social Machines, and we'll talk about that another day. At the moment, I think that's where we're in. When we get to a future world where the AI is creating those human-machine collectives, then it gets a bit more science fiction. But that's a later chapter. To close, and picking up on earlier comments, so in Oxford I'm responsible for digital humanities, or we prefer to call it digital scholarship. One of the things I've found is a common perception that if it's digital, it must somehow be correct or complete or better or authoritative. And I have the opposite argument. Just because a collection is digital doesn't mean it's complete. In fact, if it's digital, it's been encoded and you've thrown something away. So I'm used to this argument, and I try to empower humanists to challenge numbers. And we're seeing a related thing with AI, further to an earlier question about sort of, is there bias that people want to listen to machines rather than humans? So I'm seeing AI being ascribed authority in decision making. Why is it we do that? That's a question we could discuss another time. But what we need to do is teach a critical approach to these AI methods in scholarship and in life. I've always welcomed Georgina's critical approach, and I feel strongly we need a lot more of that. Today, I'm rather tired of technology, deterministic AI evangelism. So we must question the judgment of AI, and I'm really pleased that we're doing that here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.